I am going to read a list of words, and they are all synonyms for the same word. When you think that you know the word that I'm describing, hold your thought until I'm finished reading all of the words, and then I want to see if we're thinking of the same word. So our words are egotistical, self-absorbed, egocentric, self-centered, self-interested. What do you think they're all describing? I think I heard it over here. Selfish. Selfish. We're going to be talking about the word selfish this morning. And in order for us to transition into Joel's message, we're going to watch a video that's making the argument about why we should all become more selfish. So take a look.
The public story of selfishness tells us that we are, all of us, very guilty of the behaviour. We are apparently incurably addicted to our own satisfactions and deserve to be compared unfavourably to pretty much any generation that ever walked the earth. It sounds compelling. Self-flagellation usually does. But the reality may be somewhat different. Whatever the risks of excessive self-absorption and inordinate pleasure-seeking, the real danger for most people is not that they too often ignore society and other people in the name of their own needs. It's precisely the opposite. That they constantly put aside self-exploration and authentic inner development for the whims of so-called respectable opinion and socially sanctioned duties and commitments. The chief problem is not that we're too selfish. We're poor versions of what we might be because we're not selfish enough. We spend our lives seeing people we have nothing in common with, working at jobs that don't make sense to us, craving the approval of parental figures who have other priorities, going to parties we fear, sucking up to colleagues we hate, going to films that bore us, parroting opinions we're suspicious of, taking holidays that we don't enjoy, and devoting ourselves to children who end up either indifferent or plain resentful about the care we've devoted to them. Finally, in the last decade or so of life, we may try to live for ourselves, but by then, it's almost always too late. Our connections to our own tastes and centres of pleasure and interest have atrophied. We've forgotten how to be ambitious in our names. We have frittered ourselves away through millions of demands. We are alive, but we hardly exist any longer. We settle on golf. A priority, while time allows, is therefore to acquire the skill of being politely but energetically more selfish. We should, from today, simply stop seeing people we dislike and stop worrying to such an extent about the opinions of strangers. We should focus on what feels meaningful to us. We should ask ourselves what we will wish we had done when we are on our deathbeds, and do it now. We should wonder what we would do next if we had blanket permission, and go ahead and do it anyway. We probably know the life we should be leading already. We have just been hoping, and should stop hoping, that someone or something would come down from the sky and give us a definitive seal of approval. We should acquire the art of being difficult, of smiling less, of saying no more often, and of leaving the room when we want to. The world won't fall apart if we neglect some of our commitments. Perhaps we can afford to forget someone's birthday, or let the house get in a mess, fail to prepare a meal, or suggest that a grumpy relative make their own way back from the station. We have grown quietly ill, or at least dull of spirit, through constant acts of self-sacrifice. We no longer have as many years ahead as we once did. We have been good for an age. We have allowed our fear of boundless egoism to blind us to the importance of developing faith in ourselves. It may be time to take some baby steps towards intelligent selfishness.
Maybe not what you expected to hear in church this morning, is it? What did you think of that? Might have been some things that you were like, I kind of agree with that, but then some other things where you're like, that just sounds wrong. As I watched the video, I have to admit, there were some times I kind of got a little confused. It is true that we should care for ourselves. We're also not supposed to be selfish, right? I wonder how Jesus would respond to a video like that. In the story we're going to be studying today, Jesus gives us a glimpse into how he might respond to that video. So turn with me to John chapter 13. Right at the beginning, verse 1, John chapter 13, it's page 874, if you're going to be reading from one of the Bibles in your pew. So you're turning there. You might remember that last week we learned about what is called Jesus' triumphal entry. It was into the city of Jerusalem as the city is getting more and more packed full of people who have come from all over the world to celebrate the annual Jewish feast of the Passover. Chapter 13 then begins in that same week. It's now Thursday evening, a few days later, and here's what verse 1 tells us. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. So Jesus knows the end is near for him. Everything he's done over the past 3 years was building toward this moment. He knows he is about to throw his disciples into what will probably be the most confusing, troubling, and difficult experience of their lives. He knows they are going to experience tumult, and they're going to have to experience it without him there. He's leaving them. How do you prepare people for a horrible situation like that? Going back a few years to 2010, some of you that have been around Faith Church and the EC Church since that time might remember that in 2010, our denomination's bishop died suddenly, Kevin Leibensberger. I'll never forget a conversation I had with a denominational leader about how Bishop Kevin passed away. The official word was that he was killed in a car accident, and that was true. It's very sad. But there was a little bit more to the story. So before he told me that rest of the story, this particular denominational leader said to me, "Brace yourself." My eyes kind of got wide because this was a serious moment. What was he going to tell me? He wanted me to get ready. He said, brace yourself. He wanted me to prepare for something that he knew would be difficult. And he was right. I was shocked and affected emotionally when he told me that Bishop Kevin's death was ruled a suicide. It was a reminder of the reality and the seriousness with which how many people are struggling with mental health. It was an important reminder of not assuming that we might know how someone around us is feeling. Now I knew why the denominational leader had told me that. To steel myself for what might be some difficult news. So here's Jesus, knowing his disciples are about to face their own difficult news. How's he going to prepare them? Well, we read that Jesus loved them. He wanted them to know how much he loved them. That's the first principle that we learn in our story today. In life, there will be times, hopefully not too often, but there will be times when we have to give people bad news. It could be giving people the bad news of just disciplining our children. It could be a difficult conversation with a family member or a friend. It could be letting a coworker go. There's many times when we have to give people bad news. And when you have to give people bad news, make sure they know how much you love them. Lead with love. Make sure the people know how much you care for them. And this is what we are going to see from Jesus. He leads with love. Look at verse 2. It says, the evening meal was being served. The devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around him. As you know, this is the scene that we call the Last Supper. And as we're going to learn over the next few weeks, John's telling of the Last Supper does not refer to communion. It's that famous event that we're going to celebrate just after our sermon this morning, where Jesus breaks the bread and says, this is my body. And then he holds up the cup and says, this is my blood, telling his disciples that they should celebrate this in remembrance of him. We're not going to read that in John. Instead, John tells us about this event, the washing of the disciples' feet. He specifically mentions that Judas Iscariot was one of those disciples who Jesus is there washing his feet. I think this is so noticeable because we're hearing that Satan is already at work in Judas's life. And so in this intimate setting with Jesus and his closest friends, there is one who is already far gone. We know Judas is sitting there because of what we're going to read next week in John 13 in the verses that go on from starting with verse 18. So think about that with me for a minute. Jesus loves these men. There may have been women there too, we don't know. He's about to show them the extent of his love for them, and that includes Judas, the one who's going to betray him. What's more, Jesus by this time already knows that Judas will betray him, because again, we're going to read that in the verses that come up, that he's going to talk about it. And I mention that here because it is a powerful moment. Jesus showing love to the one in whom he has invested 3 years, and yet the one in whom just a couple hours will betray him. Totally different from what we heard in the video this morning. Think about how Jesus must be feeling as he washes Judas's feet. Betrayal hurts no matter who you are. Remember that Jesus was not just 100% God, as if this doesn't affect him. He was 100% human. And even the stories in the Old Testament that we read about God is that even God, who is 100% God, and we might have this idea that he is impenetrable and unchangeable and he cannot feel anything, he does feel. In the Old Testament, we read repeatedly that God is just broken because of the betrayal of the people of Israel. So whether in his divinity or whether in his humanity, we know that Jesus is feeling a lot right now. In college, a friend and I went to a concert. He was a good friend, and I was really excited to spend time with this particular friend. In fact, he was the one that reached out to me and said, hey, we ought to go to this concert. One of our favorite bands was playing at Creation when they were at Hershey one of those years. We got to the concert, and we were surprised to bump into an acquaintance, someone that we, it's kind of, like the friend of a friend. We didn't really know that well. We weren't really close to him. But my friend decided to hang out with the acquaintance basically the whole rest of the time. Barely paid me any attention. It felt like a little betrayal. And I want to be vulnerable with you for a moment here. Michelle and I often tell people who are thinking about going into pastoral ministry or or in pastoral ministry circles. And we say that even after 22 years of pastoral ministry, one of the most difficult experiences is pouring your life into someone and then having them decide to leave the church. Sometimes they leave for reasons you disagree with. Sometimes you don't even understand why they left. Sometimes they leave in hurtful ways. No matter how or why, it stings every single time. Maybe you've been there too. Jesus felt those feelings of betrayal. Relationships just can sting. And yet there he is, down on his knees, showing love to this guy, Judas, who is like the evil character of all evil characters in history. There is Jesus down on his knees, washing Judas's feet, knowing full well that Judas has already set plans in place to betray him. So different from what we just heard in the video. And it's so Jesus. So what we see from Jesus at this moment is an astounding example of loving inclusivity. Because you and I know it is very difficult to include people who hurt us. Risky. They could hurt us again. But we Christians look to Jesus to teach us how to live. And here he is showing us a uniquely Christian way to live. We love those even after they hurt us. We love those who have betrayed us. Now, whenever I talk about this, I definitely need to include a word about boundaries. I hope you've heard me say this over the years as well, because sometimes there is a need to impose healthy boundaries on people. Just because they hurt you doesn't mean we're saying, come on, hurt me again, as many times as you want. Not at all. And even Jesus would impose boundaries on people. He imposed boundaries even on his own disciples sometimes, speaking truth to them. Definitely he imposed boundaries on the crowds when he would say, okay, I'm done. I need a break and I'm going away. And I'm not telling you where I'm going. He imposed boundaries on the religious leaders who were just incredibly mean towards him. There is a way to lovingly impose boundaries on people so that they don't continue the abuse. And they should not continue that abuse. It's wrong. So here he is, loving one, though, who has betrayed him, who will betray him. How did he show that love? We read that he washed their feet. He took on the role of a servant. Now, in our culture, we don't wash feet. It's not a part of our meals. It's not a part of our hangouts. We don't live in a dusty area of the world. We wash our feet when we bathe, and at least I hope we do, and that is enough. Well, in Jesus' culture, it was a totally different story. When I was in India back in March, I was there in the dry season. And the combination of many dirt roads and very dry weather and numerous vehicles driving on those roads, dust was everywhere. We went into the grocery store and there was a film of dust over everything in the grocery store. When I went running, my shoes, my sneakers got just so dusty. After one particular run, it was a long run, and my shoes were really in bad shape with all the dust. And so I didn't know what to do. So I just got some body wash and the toilet brush, and I cleaned them out. It was so dusty. Well, foot washing was normal in that culture because of the dust. And apparently, no one had yet washed the feet of anyone there. And Jesus took the initiative and did so. This was not ordinary. He's a leader. He's a teacher. And he's washing his students' feet. In that culture, what Jesus was doing was totally unexpected. That was a dirty, smelly job that was considered to be only for the lower class of servants. And that's why Jesus' disciple Peter responds as he does in verse 6. Jesus came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, are you going to wash my feet? Peter knows his culture. The top leader does not do servant's work. Anyone else there should have been washing Jesus's feet. That was the custom. And custom, as we know, is a powerful force. You don't break customs unless you want to pay for it. That's exactly what Jesus is doing here. He is breaking a custom. Now hold that thought, this idea of Jesus breaking a custom, because he's going to talk about it further in just a moment. So here they are, Jesus breaking the custom, washing the disciples' feet, and I think Peter is embarrassed, knowing that not one of the disciples had volunteered to do what Jesus was doing. And that included Peter. There's a sense here that Jesus' act of washing their feet is a prophetic act. A prophet's primary job is to point out when they see wrong being done. And in that room, a wrong was being done. No one was stepping up to perform the customary foot washing. No one saw themselves as low enough to do such shameful work. So when Jesus does the foot washing, Peter immediately knows that Peter, should have volunteered. Jesus' initiative, therefore, is prophetic. It's revealing the other disciples' lack of initiative. And so you can almost see Peter immediately tuck his feet under his robe so Jesus can't reach them. You're not going to wash my feet, are you? And then he's like, whoa, wait, Jesus. You can't really be serious here. And what does Jesus say in verse 7? You do not realize now what I am doing, but later you will understand. Jesus is really going to do this. No matter how difficult it might be for Peter to understand, Jesus wants this to happen so that they remember something. They might not understand this something now, but they're going to remember this because it's a powerful visual demonstration of love. It brings us back to the idea of Jesus preparing his disciples. How do you prepare someone for an awful circumstance? Jesus is doing that right now. He's preparing his disciples for the agony and the pain and the confusion that is coming through this image of him bending down to wash their feet in love. He wants this image to be burned into their consciences so that they're always going to remember. Because he will not always be with them. We just had Ascension Week, or Ascension Day this past week. Those of you here in the countryside may have seen a million Amish buggies driving around. They celebrate Ascension Day. Jesus knows that he is going to return to the Father in this moment. He knows he's not always going to be with them. So he wants them to remember this powerful image of loving servanthood. It was very visceral too. Jesus is touching their feet. Michelle hates it when I touch her feet in bed. Anyone else not a foot person here? I mean, maybe we got some non-feet people around. This foot washing thing is intimate that way. Jesus is doing something here that they could feel and hear and smell and remember deeply. They would not soon forget this. And if they didn't understand it now, and they didn't, they would, he says. But Peter, he just kind of skips right over what it might be that Jesus wants him to understand. It's almost like Jesus says, Peter, you're going to understand this later. And Peter's like, no. He is fixated on this cultural embarrassment. He is feeling it. He's the disciple who has not taken the initiative to wash his rabbi's feet, and there's his rabbi wants to wash his feet. Peter feels shame in this. In a way, he should. I think Peter probably wants to just tuck his feet way back under so there's no way Jesus could touch his feet. Verse 8, he boldly says, no, you shall never wash my feet. And then imagine Jesus looking at the fierceness in Peter's eyes. Jesus loves this man. This man who's a fireball. He often speaks before he thinks. He's got great passion. Jesus knows that Peter is about to experience Jesus' death, maybe the most deeply of all those 12 disciples. He knows Peter is leadership material. The rock, Peter. And maybe that's why Peter needs Jesus to wash his feet most of all. Peter needs to let go of his pride. He needs to let go of his allegiance to these cultural norms. And that kind of letting go can be very, very difficult for those of us who have personalities like Peter. I wonder how many of us, if we were there at the Last Supper, might be reacting exactly like Peter, like, no way, Jesus, you're not washing my feet. I'm going to wash yours, but no way, you can't wash mine. But here's Jesus showing Peter this love that can feel very uncomfortable. Those of us that have a stubborn streak or a strong personality or this sense that we are in control, it can be difficult. And that's many of us as Americans. We Americans have a stubborn individualism just kind of baked into our lives. It's part of our DNA. In fact, we call it pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we are very proud of our American heritage of individualism. We figured it out by ourselves. We didn't need help. We can get a huge high off of feeling that accomplishment that I did it by myself. I recently read an article that talked about a John Wayne movie called The Searchers. Maybe you've seen it before. Maybe there's some John Wayne fans out here today. The Searchers is about a kidnapped girl who has been rescued and her family has been reunited. As the closing music swells, this author writes, John Wayne's character looks around at his family, people who have other people to lean on. And he turns and walks off into the dusty West Texas horizon, lonesome and alone. The writer says it's a classic example of a fundamental American tall tale, that of a nation built on notions of individualism, a male-dominated story filled with loners and rugged individualists who suck it up, do what needs to be done, and ride up into the sunset and say that they like it that way. We do not see this from Jesus at all. John Wayne is not a hero. This kind of story of rugged individualism is the exact opposite of what we see in Jesus. It's exactly what Peter is trying to say to, or what Jesus is trying to say to Peter. Peter, you need to let this go. It can be very deceptive, this passion or this inward addiction that we can have towards individualism. We can start to believe that we don't need help, not from others, not from God. Peter absolutely needs Jesus to wash his feet. In the rest of verse 8, Jesus says this to Peter, Peter, unless I wash you, you have no part with me. Jesus here is saying two things, and I think he's using a really kind of creative literalism and symbolism all mixed into one. First, he's saying that Peter needs to put his feet back out where Jesus can reach them and let him wash his feet. Why? Peter needs to learn humility, interdependence, working together. Abiding by these cultural norms is not always good. Sometimes cultural norms are wrong. They're not actually for our good, the good of others. In this case, Peter needed to let go of his pride. Just let his rabbi wash his feet. It'll take practice. It's not easy to let go of our pride. You might have to do it many, many, many times until it starts to feel comfortable. And Peter needs to start somewhere, Jesus is saying. And then there's a second thing, and this one I think is a little bit more symbolic, referring to the theological act of forgiveness of sin. Jesus is saying, Peter, you don't realize how much you need me to wash your feet. Now, you and I know, because we know the theology from hindsight, that it is possible to be washed through Jesus's death and resurrection. It's not a physical washing. We sing about it in some old hymns and songs about, I've been washed in the blood. It's this idea that through Jesus and the victory that he won over sin, death, and the devil, we can be cleaned, forgiven, new people. And without it, we cannot be a part of Jesus's family or his kingdom. Now, of course, Peter is not going to fully understand that at this particular moment. He's got to go through this upheaval that is about to come in his life. Crucifixion and the resurrection will take place for Peter over the next 3 days. But after that, resurrected Jesus spends time with the disciples, explaining to them all that happened. They're going to get it. When that day comes, then Peter will understand. And so what Jesus is saying here is applicable to all people. He has made a way for all people to be a part of his family, and that is exciting news for sure. We are people who can be washed. The stain of sin can be washed away. It's why our baptism that we continue to promote, and when people become Christians, we encourage them to be baptized. It's so important, this symbol of washing. And if any of you have not been baptized and want to make that symbolic proclamation to your family, to your friends, I would love to talk with you about baptism. It's important and a very, very meaningful thing. Well, when Jesus says that unless he washes Peter's feet, Peter has no part with him, that gets Peter's attention finally. Look at verse 9. Well, then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well. This is a classic overreaction by Peter. When you read the stories of Peter, there's so many of these. So we love him for his passion. You can kind of see him, if he has his feet tucked under, now he shoots them out and is like, yeah, I'm all in now. But he's also very serious. I don't think Peter is joking around here. He's the kind of personality that I can imagine the rest of the disciples would regularly be rolling their eyes. Oh my gosh, Peter, why are you being so literal again? Or, oh my gosh, there you go. Look at this guy. Why does he have to be so dramatic? Jesus was not interested in literal baths here. Symbolically, yes. He wants to wash or clean the whole person. There's a sense in which Peter is right in that, more than he realizes probably. But he's wrong. Jesus is not interested in a physical bath of the whole person. Jesus has a deeper cleaning in mind. It's emotional, intellectual, relational, spiritual. You could say that Peter is unknowingly correct that Jesus wants us to experience holistic transformation. But Peter has jumped the gun a bit, which is why Jesus says in verse 10, a person who has had a bath needs only to wash his feet. His whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you. For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. And so I think Jesus, after hearing Peter's bold proclamation, just smiles at Peter and essentially says, I'm just doing foot washings here today, Peter. You're on to something. You don't realize how clean you actually are. I think Jesus is intimating here to Peter, Peter, you are already my true follower. You have given your life to follow me. This is super meaningful to think about, especially considering what Peter will do in just a few hours' time. Peter is about to do something that you would not think a true follower would ever do. We're going to talk about that next week, but the story is that Peter is about to deny Jesus 3 times. And yet here's Jesus affirming that Peter is a true follower, showing us that Peter was genuine. But there was actually one there who wasn't genuine. And that brings us back to Judas and the amazing example of Jesus still washing his feet. Jesus loves Judas. Even at the end, he's reaching out to him, speaking truth to him, knowing that Judas has not given his life to Jesus like Peter did. In fact, like we said already, Judas was in the process of actively working against Jesus, and yet Jesus loves him in that moment anyway. And that explains why Jesus washed their feet. Look at how he describes it in verses 12 through 17. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set an example that you should do as I have done for you. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. This is the countercultural Jesus, the rabbi doing servant's work. Do you see how radical this is? He's a rabbi, lowering himself down to the position of the servant. Such a powerful image here. But it wasn't just radical in his culture, it's still radical in ours today. And so how do we practice this in our culture? When Jesus says that he has set an example that his disciples should do for others as he has done for them, is he saying that he wants us to practice ritual foot washing at our worship services? Let's not be overly literal here. We can, if we want to, and actually we have in the past, at Monday, Thursday. It's been a few years since we have been combining our Monday, Thursdays with First Baptist, but prior to that, we did include foot washing. Monday, Thursday is the evening that we remember the Last Supper, and we included that as a part of that particular worship service. Some other churches do it, like the Grace Brethren do it once a quarter, I believe, at their love feasts as a part of communion. There's nothing wrong with that. But Jesus is actually teaching a principle here. He's not teaching us a ritual. I'll never forget a conversation I had when I was a missionary intern in Guyana, South America. It was the summer between my junior and senior year of college. And I was talking to the leader of the denomination there that I was working with. He was a Guyanese man. He told me about the man who was just below him in the denominational chart, the number 2 man in the denomination. And he said, that man is an example of a servant leader. And you know why? He's willing to clean up vomit in the nursery. I thought that was interesting. It really stuck with me. There's nothing a servant leader thinks is beneath him or her. In fact, Jesus is specifically calling his disciples to be people who treat others with the same kind of sacrificial love that he demonstrated for them. That means you and I are not on some kind of trajectory where we're going to get promoted higher and higher and higher in the church and get more and more and more leadership positions so that people will serve us. Instead, followers of Jesus are people who give ourselves to serve, meaning that we're willing to go lower and lower, just like he did. When you walk in the building and find that the bathroom toilets need to be cleaned, the servant leader will clean them. When you find out that there are refugees in our community, like we heard about from Church World Service a few weeks ago, that need help, a servant leader will help them. When you hear that there is some sort of opening in a volunteer capacity, maybe in the life of our church, like the nursery, or we need instrumentalists, we need singers, a servant leader is willing to help out. I recently saw an example of this that was so inspiring to me, right here in the life of our congregation. People that gave themselves to serve. And I want to thank them. You realize that we have people who volunteer every week to count the offering. I know some of you know that, but maybe some of you, that's just one of those things that you don't even really think about. This gets counted, right? Well, people do that. For the last few years, we've had 6 of them that we call them stewards. 6 stewards. It might sound like a lot. When you consider that we require there to be 2 stewards every Sunday to count for accountability purposes, it means that on average, a steward was counting once every 3rd week. That adds up. Over the course of a year, that's more than once a month. And our stewards have been doing that sacrificially, giving of their time, and that's amazing. And we also wanted to see if we could lighten their load a little bit. And so we put out a plea to some people in the congregation. It wasn't a church-wide plea. Just asked a couple people, would you consider being a steward? And we had 4 people sign up. It was awesome. So over the next 2 months, these new stewards will come on board, and now each steward will be serving less than once a month. It's a wonderful thing to see that kind of generosity of sacrifice. It means less people become tired, less people feel burdened and are in danger of burnout. It means we're functioning as a church family, a team working together. Now, obviously, that's one way. There are all sorts of ways to serve. And it's not just in the church. There are those, of course, we have our serve teams. And I'd love to talk with you. If you're not participating on one of our serve teams and you know that God has gifted you and there might be a way that you can serve, love to see how we can fit you where you're serving in a way that God has gifted you, if at all possible. So let's talk about that. We could use more volunteers in a variety of ways. You can also serve in the community. And I think this is really important because we should be known as a church who are people that serve our community. It's awesome to see so many people from Faith Church serving the Seeds ESL classes in the fall and in the spring. People prepping meals and donating them. People serving as teachers, people serving as childcare workers, people serving as the directors of the program. It was amazing. Our outreach serve team has been thinking about how we can be a blessing. And I encourage you to talk with Chris Latcher more about that. There's a book study that she is trying to encourage people to come around. And the whole purpose of the book study is how we can be a blessing to our community through serving. Church World Service needs volunteers, like we heard 2 weeks ago in refugee resettlement. The school district needs volunteers in various buildings. CVCCS needs mentors for kids in their Rooted program. Our summer lunch club is going to need volunteers. And I want you to hear that I'm not calling you to serve solely for the benefit of others. And this is where I think the video is so wrong. It maybe had some good points. I don't think everything the video said was 100% wrong. There is an important need for self-care. But Jesus showed us the way of servant leadership, not only because it will help others, but because it is for our best as well. When we serve others, it is amazing the reciprocal, mutual benefit that is involved. Serving others in love is good for them, but what we can so often be surprised to find is that it's good for us too. Personally, and as a church family together. So let us people who are known for serving in love.